Good morning. My name is Arun Sharma. I'm the Deputy Vice Chancellor at Queensland University of Technology. I'll be very briefly here to say a few words and introduce the chair of the panel, who will introduce the other speakers. The subject of the panel is changing foreign policy in a changing Asia. And in the context of the conference topic, the argumentative Indian, I think one distinction about argumentative Indian has not been made very clearly today, and that is quite evident in the book. I think every society is argumentative. The distinction is being public about the argumentation. The Indian argumentation is very public and open, and I think that's the context where different issues are going to be addressed. Now, what does foreign policy mean in a changing Asia, where societies that argue and societies that do not publicly argue have to interact with each other? And in some sense, the changing technology, the social media, is making societies that like to argue in private also argue in public. And that is one of the contexts that is going to define how the foreign policy debate is practiced, not just in the context of territorial disputes, not just in the context of economic supremacy or economic competition, not just in the context of cultural soft power competitiveness, but also in terms of the exchange of people, the social media, and the public argumentation in society. So with those few words, it is my pleasure to introduce the chair of the session, Honorable Professor Gareth Evans, ACQC. Gareth Evans is the Chancellor of the Australian National University, a professorial fellow at the University of Melbourne, and President Emeritus of the Brussels-based International Crisis Group, an organization for which he was the President and Chief Executive Officer. He has contributed very significantly, not just to Australian foreign policy, but to global policy on international issues. He has co-chaired two major international commissions on intervention in state sovereignty and on nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament. He is a first-rate mind with degrees from University of Melbourne and Oxford. He was a law academic and also a practicing lawyer and became a Queen's Counsel. Professor Evans was a member of the Australian Parliament for 21 years and served as Foreign Minister from 1988 to 1996. I came to Australia in 1991, and I used to live in the US, and I saw Australia from the outside, from the eyes of Gareth Evans, and he formed the prism of Australia's place in the world for the first half decade of my stay in Australia, and I owe a great deal to understanding this. So it's a pleasure to welcome Gareth, who will introduce the other speakers. Okay. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Professor Sharma, for that very comprehensive and generous introduction. My old friend and sparring partner, M.K. Narayanan, other very distinguished guests, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Well, welcome to what promises to be, I think, one of the most fascinating sessions of this conference, not least because it follows so directly on M.K. Narayanan's splendid opening address. As Prime Minister Paul Keating might have put it, every parrot in every pet shop is now talking about the Asian century, and in particular the rise of China and now India, back to the point of them being about to resume sooner or later what Kishore Mahbubani keeps reminding us is their traditional historical places as the world's two largest economies, with the last 200 years having been simply just an aberration in the millennia-old order of things. So the air is now thick with metaphors about the scale and significance of what we're witnessing. The tectonic plates are shifting, you will have heard, and thick with metaphors about what we may be fearing when elephants fight, the grass gets trampled, and so on. So how India and China will react to each other, how each of them will react to the US and it to them, and what all this means for other countries in the region will certainly be the stuff of conferences for years to come, and plenty to keep us going this morning. Maybe a lot of the language about this is a little bit overdrawn, the language of great power rivalry, as M.K. Narayanan said in passing this morning, but nonetheless there are a whole series of questions which I think are legitimately raised by the present environment. And let's think about some of them as an introduction to what will follow. Will the United States, for a start, insist on trying to stay top dog on the global and indeed the regional bloc in perpetuity? Or will it, as I heard Bill Clinton put it in a private function a decade ago, will it rather choose, as I hope it might, to use its enormous economic and military power to create a world in which the US will be comfortable living when it's no longer top dog on the global bloc? Will the ever-growing economic interdependence between the major players, with the US and China totally joined at the wallet, and the China-India economic relationship growing apace, will any of this mean that war now is simply unthinkable? Or are there still lessons to be learned from the pre-World War I period, when the similarly optimistic argument, you remember most famously put by Norman Angell in his pamphlet The Great Illusion, about the integration of the European economies having grown to such a degree that war between them would be entirely futile, and that's a perception which proved utterly misplaced. Will that be the prevailing scene that evolves? Is it the case that Steven Pinker, the Harvard psychologist, argues in his monumental and I think very compelling new book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, The Decline of Violence in History and Its Causes, is it the case that we really have learned something from the catastrophes of the 20th century and are actually seeing now a worldwide normative embrace of the conviction that war is inherently immoral because of its cost to human well-being and can be only justified on the very rare occasions when it's certain to prevent even greater costs in human well-being? So that war, or at least perhaps interstate war between the major developed countries, is going the way of slavery, disemboweling and public executions, passing from unexceptionable to controversial to immoral to unthinkable. Is that the scenario that's evolving? Or is it rather the case that poor leadership, human error, misjudgment and system error is so inexhaustible that we simply can't ever assume that any kind of rationality will prevail if tensions grow and if nationalist instincts gather real momentum? Is the Chinese chest-beating nationalism that we're now seeing in the South China Sea, which MK put it rather more gently and more diplomatically, is this just a function of leaders and officials covering their tails against criticism during an extremely sensitive leadership transition period in China, or does it suggest some more visceral and worrying current emerging? Is China's so-called string of pearls strategy for the Indian Ocean a figment of overheated commentariat imagination, or is it the case that what M.K. Narayanan described rather delightfully as the not-so-subtle wooing of some of India's neighbours in this region really is something for us to worry about? Or is it the case that to the extent that Beijing does seek to acquire some serious blue water capability here, is that no more than an entirely defensible interest being pursued that any major power would have in contributing to the protection of its vital sea loans? And then finally, to look at in this panel, I hope, where does Australia fit in all of this? Even if our entire population could fit into Shanghai and almost into Greater Mumbai, does our weight as the 13th biggest economy in the world, and of course as a major resource supplier to the region, and does our strategic position between South Asia and East Asia, at the heart of the Indo-Pacific, if not the Asia-Pacific, does this actually make us a country that matters in geopolitical and strategic terms? How should we play the hands that history and geography have dealt us? Is it just a matter of keeping out of trouble and hoping that we never have to choose in some kind of zero-sum game trade-off between the US and China in particular? Or should we be playing a more active role in building our own military capability? If so, how? And our cooperative defence relationships? What are the risks, if any, in us formally engaging in some quadrilateral configuration with India, Japan, the US, which might be seen again by China, for better or worse, as some kind of containment exercise? Is it the case, finally, as I saw Pramit Palchowdhury suggesting in a recent piece in the Hindustan Times, is it the case that the Prime Ministership of Kevin Rudd was seen in New Delhi, as sinophobe, and that Hugh White's recent strategic writing has been seen in Delhi as advocacy of Beijing appeasement or Finlandisation down under. Whatever the accuracy of these characterisations, and I, for one, think they're wildly overdrawn, what should we do about them if that is the perception that's out there? Well, I don't know whether our panel is going to address all these questions, but I certainly hope and expect that they'll cover a fair number of them in their initial 10-minute presentations. We couldn't have a better line-up in this respect before us this morning, and I'll introduce them now in the order in which they'll speak. First of all, we have Sadhnan Dumay, who is a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C. And Sadhnan will make the case for an Indian foreign policy which actually tilts toward the US rather than seeking equidistance from Washington and Beijing. Then we've got David Malone, a very distinguished Canadian diplomat, including the UN in New York and, of course, as Ambassador High Commissioner to Delhi. Currently President of the IDRC in Canada, but about to take up the hopefully not poisoned chalice of the rectorship of the UN University in Tokyo. And David is going to focus on India's relations not only with the US and China, but also the BRICS countries and the IBSA forums, India, Brazil, South Africa. Then we've got Siddharth Varadarajan, of course, who is editor of The Hindu, and a very distinguished and prize-winning journalist for many years. And Siddharth's going to discuss Asian security architecture from India's perspective and the desirability, he tells me, of India adopting a fluid and contingent approach to the great power relationships, avoiding either tilts or equidistance. And then finally we have Michael Wesley, former head of the Lowy Institute, who I'm delighted to be able to tell you was announced this morning as the new Professor of National Security at the Australian National University. Michael is also the, which is a feather in the cap. Michael, as most of you know, is also the author of the splendidly entitled recent book, There Goes the Neighbourhood. And Michael will give his own take from an Australian perspective on the regional security environment. Well, that's more than enough throat clearing. On with the show, and here we go, first of all, with Sadhnan Dumay.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thank you, Professor Mattu, and all of you for being over here. I've been tasked with being provocative this morning to set this off, and I hope to live up to that task. I'm going to start out with a bit of a fictional thought experiment. And for that, what I'd like you to do is imagine a country. This is an imaginary country which I'm going to call Despotistan. And events are going to occur in Despotistan, and there's certain responses that I believe will come from India. And I'm going to use this little example to give what I think, to create what I think are clarifying choices between what paths India could pursue. So Despotistan is a dusty outcrop of about 500,000 people and an equal number of highly prized goats. It's halfway around the world from India. It has no significant Indian diaspora and no significant trade with India. It's run by a sultan, and the Sultan of Despotistan is a vain man who dresses only in baby crocodile skin and carries a gold cane topped with a skull. His neighbors despise him. One fine day, civil war breaks out in Despotistan. There are grave worries about what the Sultan might do to the population. And in the United States, various groups, particularly PETA, begin to agitate about the fate of the wildlife population and so on. Over time, congressmen with constituents who emigrated from Despotistan get involved, and pressure rises on the US government to do something about this scary civil war situation. The US calls for a meeting of the UN Security Council to authorize the use of force to protect the citizens of Despotistan. At that moment in time, the the Security Council happens to include Australia, Japan, India, and Russia, among other countries. This is the situation. Now, what happens in India? Here's my prediction. The moment these troubles break out in Despotistan, you begin to hear rumbles from South Bloc about India's historic ties with the friendly people of Despotistan. Pretty soon, you have an op-ed by a leading foreign affairs commentator appear in a venerable newspaper that argues that the Sultan of Despotistan has always held a special regard for India. A picture is dug up that shows the Sultan giving a bear hug to Indira Gandhi at a NAM summit in Havana. A retired foreign secretary chimes in with the theory that India is poised to capture the goatskin market when the grateful Sultan rewards friends who have stood by him. At the UN, Russia vetoes a resolution. India, of course, abstains. The US and its allies arm the rebels anyway, and 3 months later, the Sultan of Despotistan is no more. Now, the purpose of this story really is to illustrate a larger point. And my larger point is that when you look at India, we tend to look at 1991 as this point of rupture. But I would argue that the rupture in India has really been quite incomplete. So both in terms of economic policy and in terms of foreign policy, there has been significant change, and there has been significant progress, and it's moved in the right direction. But India hasn't had what I would call a Berlin Wall moment, where the people who were responsible for the policies until 1991 were largely discredited or wholly discredited. And I think this failure this not having a Berlin Wall moment has, there's certain strengths. I mean, for one big strength in the Indian context is that India's policy is not being run by a bunch of upstart 40-year-olds who don't have any sense of the past. But I think it also creates certain weaknesses if you come from my position, which essentially is arguing that the policies followed before 1991, and in this case, I'll be talking about foreign policy, were largely inimical to India's own national interest. And by this I mean specifically non-alignment. I'm going to paint the sort of what I see as the vestiges of an earlier way of thinking that may not be dominant but still exists, is dominant in some circles, notably the IIC bar, with what I think would be a different, more practical, more realist way of looking at Indian foreign policy, which also exists, but may not be as dominant as I would like it to see. And I'm oversimplifying here for the sake of contrast, realizing that many people in the audience over here are not exactly people who spend a lot of time thinking about Indian foreign policy. So here are a set of contrasts. The first would be that in the sort of what we'd call the non-aligned school, or what we'd call the old school of thinking, it seeks to build a bridge with India's past. There's a go-it-alone attitude, which is an end in itself. And if I were to quote a report in which many of the people involved that are over here, called Non-Alignment 2.0, which came out earlier this year, I quote, "Strategic autonomy has been the defining value and continuous goal of India's international policy ever since its inception as a republic." In contrast, there are those who would argue that these ideas of the past are largely discredited. And here I'd like to quote the former Indian ambassador to the US, K. Shankar Bajpai, who argues that reviving the concept of non-alignment specifically, is, I quote, "all too likely to drive our people back to something that is not only long outdated, but, and this is its dangerous legacy, which we still fail to recognize as having done us more harm than good." Secondly, I would say the old-style thinking is rooted in the implicit belief that India, in fact, has little to learn from the diplomatic experience of other countries. Most other countries are simply not big enough to offer lessons to India, and the only country that is big enough to offer lessons to India is not democratic enough to offer lessons to India. So therefore, India sort of comes to its own conclusions about everything. And again, this is a sort of source of great strength in many ways, but I would argue that, in fact, it makes sense for India to learn from the successes of smaller countries that have used their foreign policy successfully to protect their national interests, while also coupling this with very successful domestic economic policies. And the kind of countries that I mean that offer lessons to India would include Singapore, even though it's tiny, Indonesia, South Korea, and of course Australia. Thirdly, we come to the idea, which is the sort of heart of what I'm talking about, which is that should India seek equidistance between the US and the West more broadly and a rising China, or not, or should it tilt one way or the other? I would argue that India should tilt very clearly towards the US and the West. This does not mean that India should seek a formal alliance. I don't think that's possible. I don't think that's likely. I don't think that's sort of even vaguely plausible. But I think that India's interests are not, it is not equally good for India to see a rising authoritarian China be dominant in the Pacific. It's not, that is not comparably equal to having what we've seen over the last, since World War II, essentially, the U.S. being... some water, sorry. With the U.S. being dominant, and essentially what India ought to be looking for is a period of peace and stability in Asia, which allows India to get on with the task of economic development. We have seen that keeping the trade lanes open, keeping Southeast Asia peaceful, has largely worked for the most successful economies of the region, whether it's Malaysia, whether it's Singapore, whether it's Indonesia, and so on. And what India needs over the next 10, 20, 25 years is more of that. And under those circumstances, it is much better for India to be part of the existing order, grow within that existing order, seek a greater role in that existing order, seek to assert itself more in that existing order and acquire more power, but not to fundamentally overturn it. So in short, India should not join any formal alliance against China. It should not explicitly try to contain China, but nor should it be neutral between China and the West. India's natural affinities are with the English-speaking world. It's with argumentative Americans, argumentative Australians and Canadians and others. It's the fact of democracy matters as a value. The fact that there are large Indian diaspora populations in the English-speaking democracies of the world links India much more closely with ties of kinship and education with these countries than with others. And so, to sum up, what I'd like to bring it back to the Republic of Despotistan, what I'm sort of trying to say, essentially, with this sort of somewhat lighthearted example, is that this means choosing wisely, and this means not necessarily getting involved in every conflict or everything that happens anywhere in the world, and deciding that India's own core interests, and in this case the core security interests would be the threat from kind of radical jihadism that we see coming out of Pakistan on the one hand, and frankly the uncertainty of China's rise. It may not be a threat, but it very well may be a threat. I think if those are the core security concerns that India faces, its best bet lies in building closer ties with like-minded democracies, and that would be the most logical hedge for the current world that we're in and the shape of Asia that we see right now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sun, for that contribution to the finest traditions of the American Enterprise Institute, which will no doubt generate a little bit of a response. Thank you also very much for keeping broadly within the time constraint of 10 minutes, which I have tried to enforce for all our panellists to give us, against the odds, maximum time for genuine discussion in the audience. David Malone.
Great, Gareth. Thank you very much. Amitav, congratulations. Only you could have pulled off this conference, and only you have. And MK, thank you very much for your remarks this morning. While I was living in India, about once a year, sometimes twice a year, the National Security Advisor would deliver himself of some superficially off-the-cuff remarks, which were always deeply thoughtful and proved out extremely well over subsequent years. So many of us were listening very carefully this morning and weren't disappointed. I think there are many ways of slicing and dicing Indian foreign policy. One way would be to look at history, geography, and capability as an organizing framework for it. This morning, I thought I'd look at a couple of impulses in Indian foreign policy. One is strategic restraint, which India has practiced quite a lot, particularly over the last 15 years when faced with security provocations from next door during Kargil, following the Mumbai bombings. But the more relevant one was mentioned by Sadnand, which is India's essential and enduring quest for autonomy in international relations. And I don't think that is narrowly tied to non-alignment. I think non-alignment was a defensive strategy for India at a time when it was economically flat on its back. I don't think it's particularly the case today. But the quest for autonomy endures. And why? Well, think of history. For Australians, for Canadians, when we think of the British Empire, we tend to take a rather benign view of it. For Australians and Canadians of European extraction, empire worked pretty well. Our indigenous compatriots might disagree, but Australia, New Zealand, Canada are probably the big success stories of British Empire. For India, British Empire was an unalloyed catastrophe, and it has shaped Indian perceptions of the outside world, of inevitably the Western world, and indeed may have distorted them relative to contemporary realities. Let me give you a couple of figures to define how much of a disaster for India empire was. Economic historians and historians of economic bent have been focusing over the last 30 years on global economic output over the last 2 or 3 millennia. On average, China might have contributed 25% to global economic output. On average, what we think of as India today might have contributed 17 to 22% at any given time. And when the British came to India, India wasn't particularly well governed, which made it easy for Britain to take over. So let's say it was at the low end of that estimate, around even 15%, let's say. All you need to know about empire in India is when the British left, India was contributing less than 2% to global output. That's all you really need to know. Empire was a project of economic exploitation of India, and it was tremendously successful for the Brits and disastrous for India. Another way of looking at the figures is that over 200 years of British rule, India's economic output was flat while its population grew. So India came to independence with virtually no capability at the international level and with a number of resentments. Nehru, in writing about what the foreign policy of an India might be during the 1920s, had already focused his thinking on the United States. He considered Britain already clapped out, and India's independence would be proof of that. But he was very focused on the United States as the coming imperial power. That probably did not serve India well as an enduring guide to policy, but it was the reality at the time India became independent. And keeping India's distance from the West, unfortunately, in many ways, became a guiding principle. It left India open, by the way, to hypocrisy because the policy of non-alignment was made a sham when, for defensive reasons, India aligned somewhat with the Soviet Union in order to benefit from its veto in the Security Council in 1971. But is the idea of autonomy a bad idea for India? I would argue no. I think it's a good idea for India. Why? India's great challenges are internal. They're not international. And while India wants to chart a thoughtful course, aware of its neighborhood, making a contribution along the lines that the governor outlined for us earlier today, the idea that India should allow itself to be instrumentalized by the pivot of this great power or that is, I think, unhelpful in the extreme for the countries nourishing this delusion. It's simply not going to happen. India has its own interests. Its perception of its interests isn't incompatible necessarily with the interests of others, but it's very different. And the governor mentioned Iran. Perceptions by India and the United States of Iran are quite different. Both countries agree that Iran would like to attain nuclear weapons status, but they disagree on how to discourage Iran from that goal. And that's perfectly legitimate, it seems to me. So I think this enduring quest for autonomy will continue. How does that manifest itself a bit more positively in India's foreign policy? Well, first of all, an idea the French were very keen on a number of years ago, and we hear less about from them today, multipolarity works very well for India because India can be a pole in a multipolar world. Secondly, there are other countries with which India can and enjoys working at times, not least because if you work with them multilaterally, it's one way of, in a sense, working also on bilateral relations, would be the BRICS organization. Brazil, Russia, India, China, and now South Africa. The problem with the BRICS is it's an incoherent forum. It's a forum of wannabes, and it's a forum of countries with radically different interests, in fact. So while it's a useful forum for meeting and transacting business and sharing opinions, as votes in the Security Council make clear, there is no prospect of joint positions within the BRICS on anything that matters geostrategically. On the other hand, India has helped build a forum which doesn't get much ink in countries like Australia and Canada, called IPSA, India, Brazil, South Africa, which styles itself as the forum of the leading private sector-oriented democracies of their continents, not a bad brand for a pickup group of nations. And there, with the private sector in the lead of the economic agenda, and the governments having more in common, frankly, in terms of values than the BRICS do, there is more of an opportunity of fine-tuning positions. In the West, we're no longer aware that a lot of contemporary diplomacy goes on in forums we don't belong to. Shanghai Cooperation Organization, IPSA, BRICS, and so on. And so we think it's irrelevant because we're not there. But actually, it's quite relevant precisely because we aren't there. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks so much, David. Siddharth Radharajan.
There's not that much more to add after David, because I agree with virtually everything he said. I thought I would like to, as one of the authors involved with Nonalignment 2.0, the report that Sadanand referred to, I thought I would try to give you a little bit of background in terms of how those of us who wrote that report saw India's position in the changing world, because I think that provides a clue to the topic for our discussion today on changes happening in Asia and the kind of role that India, Australia, other countries could play. And I think the first point to bear in mind is when we talk of Asian security, particularly in Australia, for example, is the rather unique position that India occupies in the Asian continent. We are at the western extremity of East Asia. We are obviously in South Asia. We are a stone's throw from West Asia, where we have enormous economic interests, large Indian diasporas present there. We've had historical, cultural, and now increasingly modern economic ties with Central Asia. And of course, India sits at the top of the Indian Ocean. So from every geographical point of view, there is no Asian security question that India can really afford to be aloof from. And what happens in one part of Asia invariably impinges on India in a much more critical way than arguably any other Asian power. For that reason, I think India needs to approach the emerging or changing situation in Asia with a great deal of caution. And David spoke about multipolarity. The regional expression of that in Asia is that we are today going through a situation of where there is no equilibrium. You have an unbalanced situation, a very dynamic unfolding scenario, marked by the historic decline of the American alliance system and America's military capabilities, its capabilities to not only wreck old orders, but also to create new orders, to create new systems. That's one aspect of this disequilibrium. You have the other equally important aspect, the rise of China. And of course, the rise of other countries, India, Indonesia, ROK, Iran, all of which are contributing to a very, very fluid security scenario in Asia. Now, what makes life especially complicated for India is that the level of uncertainty is actually, thanks to some of the actions of big powers like the United States and China, the amount of uncertainty and instability in our immediate and extended neighborhood is actually increasing. We are today in a very potentially dangerous situation with regard to the unfolding Iran scenario. We don't know 6 months from now or a year from now how United States-Iran relations are going to change. Will there be confrontation? Will there be conflict? To the east of India, Chinese heavy-handed approach to the South China Seas, it's the whole raking up of territorial claims has again made the maritime security situation and the wider Asian security position very, very unpredictable, very, very unstable. Now, how should a country like India react to this kind of a situation? And what we have been doing, I mean, there's a tremendous amount of consensus in a normally very divided country. But broadly speaking, India has reacted to this kind of challenge in two ways. One, to do what it can in its immediate neighborhood, to repair relations that had frayed over the years or that had weakened or that had atrophied, relations that at one point had some economic content to them, but which over the years we allowed those economic commercial ties to atrophy. Today, India pays a lot of attention, whether it's Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka, the Maldives, even Pakistan, with which we have a very testy political relationship. There is a very definite push to see what we can do to revive or to build a strong economic content. So managing South Asia, managing India's relations within South Asia is a very important aspect of what we are trying to do at this time. And of course, the second is to look at the uncertainty and the disequilibrium in the wider Asian region, not as a threat so much as a challenge, an opportunity for us to play a role in the establishment or building of some kind of architecture. There are a number of organizations, a number of initiatives which exist: East Asia Summit, Shanghai Cooperation, SAARC, ASEAN, ARF, the Indian Ocean region area of cooperation, a number of initiatives which India is taking part in, but all of these have failed so far to coalesce into something very, very concrete and with a strong security or a security dimension. But I would argue that building, contributing, doing what we can to build or to create an Asian architecture is something that India cannot ignore and something that India has to actively engage in. Now, what this means, of course, is that we have to deal with the two biggest powers in Asia. One, a geographical presence here, which is China, the other, a military presence, the United States. Deal with both of these big powers from a position of confidence and strength, and not from a not from somebody who is terrified by the rise of China or somebody who feels that they have no alternative but to tilt, as Sadanand argued, in favor of the United States. Now, when I say that, I don't mean that there will not be areas of extensive cooperation. If I were to make a confession, the authors of Nonalignment 2.0, which really was not arguing for anything very radical. We were arguing, putting sinews on what is the golden mean of Indian foreign policy today, which is that you build partnerships, you strengthen your relationships with all power centers without getting into any permanent military entanglement with any of them, which means your approach is fluid, it's contingent. If a situation arises where you have to work with the United States, you do so. If a situation arises where you work with the Chinese or the Brazilians, you do so. Now, our understanding was that in the in the current Indian political climate, resistance to the idea of working with all powers, including the United States, should a situation arise, would come from the center-left. And at least I had imagined that a book title, Nonalignment 2.0, when you frame your strategy, when you cloak it in the language of the familiar, in a way it helps to make the whole policy more acceptable, more understandable, from the perspective of a center-left polity that is wary of working closely with the United States, say, or with other Western powers as and when the situation arises. What took us by surprise was the ferocious reaction from pro-American quarters in India and from the American establishment, which reacted with a visceral hatred towards the phrase non-alignment. Nowhere in the monograph were we advocating a return to the politics of a movement and an era that clearly has passed. But non-alignment the phrase non-alignment 2.0, which emphasized the importance of strategic autonomy, and which, in a way, attempts to link up to a constituency, a global constituency that still puts a lot of store by what India can do to push the global system in a more equitable direction. We were astonished by the fierce reaction that this triggered, and the only conclusion that I could draw was that the United States has, and here it's not all that different from China, takes a very, very instrumental view of its relationships and partnerships. It is very demanding. It gets very upset at the first sign of strategic promiscuity, for want of a better term. And the idea that India could want to build closer relations with the US, but also with China, also with Russia, which is what non-alignment 2.0 is all about in its essence, is something that many American commentators and many in the American establishment found utterly repulsive. And this mirrored, in a sense, in a curious sort of way, the Chinese approach, which sees in every strengthening of the India-US relationship something that is necessarily aimed against China. So when you're caught in a situation in Asia where you have to manage this triangular relationship, where the Chinese are suspicious of every step we take with the Americans, and the Americans are suspicious of every step we take with Iran or China or BRICS or IPSA or whatever, it makes sense to position ourselves in a way that our relationship with either of the two powers is not contingent on the relationship between those two powers. And the mistake that, the biggest mistake we could make is to tailor India-China relations or to build India-US relations on a certain assumption of what US-China relations are going to look like in the future. And I would argue that if we think of India, the US, and China as three ends of a triangle, a sensible policy for India in the changing Asian environment would be to ensure that its own relations with America and with China are stronger than the Sino-US relationship. Today, that's not the case. And India, which will always find itself caught in a situation when US-China relations improve, say, India-US relations would then deteriorate, which is not a happy position for us to be in. So I think approaching the changing Asian environment with confidence is something that India needs to do. And this means, as I said earlier, that you don't tie yourselves up in a firm sort of way with any big power, the United States or China, but you will be prepared on a contingent basis to work on a case-by-case basis with any and everybody. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Siddharth. Michael Wesley.
Thanks, Gareth, and can I add my compliments to Amitabh and your colleagues for putting such a terrific conference together. Ladies and gentlemen, Gareth has instructed me to give the Australian perspective on all of this, and as of this morning, he's my ultimate boss. I better do as he asks. We in Australia have been talking about the rise of Asia for a very long time. You could go back half a century and you could see Australians talking about the rise of Asia and what it means for Australia. And if you go back through all of those considerations and writings, what you find is an underlying discomfort there. And the discomfort is that the rise of Asia will ultimately mean that Australia will find itself trapped or suspended between its existing great power friend, the United States, and a rising or several rising Asian powers. Half a century ago it was Japan. Today it's China. Who knows, tomorrow it may be India. So there are the cause of the discomfort behind all of this is the question, will Australia be forced to choose between the old and the new? The current question is, does the fact that China is our largest trading partner and the United States is our main security partner, does that mean that Australia's prosperity interests and its security interests are now pulling in different directions? A decade ago, John Howard, the Prime Minister then, put it that will Australia be forced to choose between its history and its geography? And going back even further, Samuel Huntington asked the question, will this all turn Australia into a torn country, quote unquote? Now there's an assumption that underlies all of these questions and this deep uncertainty and discomfort in Australia about the rise of Asia. And I think you could capture it in the following terms. That as long as the established power, the United States, and the rising power, be it Japan or China or potentially India, get on, Australia's okay. Australia can get along in this world. But if they slide into confrontation or clash, Australia is in trouble. We're in for extremely difficult times. I think you can find that level of uncomfort, that uncomfortable question, at the heart of Australian considerations of the rise of Asia for at least half a century or so. But what I'd like to argue today is that I think this question, or this formulation that as long as the great powers get on, we're okay, and if they don't, we're in trouble, I think that's profoundly mistaken. Because I think what we are moving into in the region is a situation that's best described as a strategic dynamic of rivalrous interdependence. Rivalrous interdependence. What do I mean by that? Let me deal with the interdependence first. What we've seen over the last 20 years is a remarkable reorientation of the regional economy. Starting at least in 1949, China, the traditional historical hinterland, economic hinterland of the Pacific economies of Asia, was cut off from those economies. And the United States assumed the role as the consumer, the investor, and the dynamic centre of the Pacific Asian economies. During the 1990s, particularly as the Chinese economy opened to the world, China re-established itself as the economic hinterland of Pacific Asia. And what we've seen is the re-establishment, or the establishment, should I say, of a system of tightly integrated, distributed manufacturing centred on China in the Asian region. And the best way you can see that is look at the countries in this part of the world. There are not very many of them that don't have China as their number one trading partner. And if they don't have China as their number one trading partner, it's in their top three. And if it's not in their top three, it's in their top five. It's an extraordinary list. I don't have time to go through it. So basically, we have seen a regional economy recenter on China. That's the interdependence part of things. Rivalry. The rivalry part of things comes from the fact that for the first time in a very long time, it's very hard to find historical examples of this occurring. But for the first time, the countries in this region are becoming increasingly economically dependent on a country that makes them nervous. Whether it's China's opacity in terms of its own decision-making, whether it's its opacity in terms of what it intends to do with all this power and wealth, whether it's the civilizational rivalries that exist in this part of the world with its deeply hierarchic social structures and cultures, or whether it's a series of actual disputes between regional countries and China. What we are seeing is a rising China amid a region of countries that is increasingly nervous about the rise of China and is increasingly nervous about the prospect of a region that is dominated by China. And so we have a system of countries that are reaching out to each other and to the United States to hedge their bets. The other part of the rivalrous interdependence, the rivalrous part of it, is a dynamic of destabilising prosperity, a dangerous combination of power, vulnerability and entitlement. The fact is that, as with every other great power in history, the more power China gets, the more vulnerable it feels. And that occurs for other great powers as well, and I would argue that that is occurring for India as well. And with the power and vulnerability comes a sense of entitlement, that because these countries are starting to become powerful and important in the global economy, they need to be treated as such, and they aren't being treated as such. Back to my original question. In a world of rivalrous interdependence, I believe great power relations are increasingly two-tiered. What I mean by that is that when the great powers are getting on ostensibly, it doesn't mean that the smaller countries like Australia have a free ride or an easy situation. Let me give you an example. Earlier this year... Michael, 2 minutes. 2 minutes? You've been going for 10, mate. Okay. All right. I better not give you an example. Australia is entering a period of increasingly jealous great power relations between all of these players. Even small, seemingly domestic decisions in Australia are overinterpreted by great powers. Our decision, or the Rudd government's decision, not to sell uranium to India, very hard to convince Indians that that wasn't motivated by China. The decision to rotate 2,500 Marines through Darwin, interpreted very differently in China from how we expected. Or the decision to tell Huawei Technologies not to bid for the national broadband network. This is a much more complex, much more dangerous period. Australia will not benefit from moving one way or the other. None of the other countries of our size in this region are going either towards China or the United States. They are hedging nicely in the middle, and I think that's where we will end up. So my conclusion is, for Australia, what this new, difficult and complex world of rivalrous interdependence means is that we are now leaving the period in which foreign policy in this country was seen as an arcane and largely irrelevant pursuit, pursued by pinstripe diplomats. The foreign policy decisions that we are making and that will have an effect on our international positions will affect our society deeply and should become part of a much deeper and complex domestic conversation. Thank you.
Well, we have 20 minutes or so to discuss the issues that have been raised. If we can crib a little bit of time out of lunch, maybe a little more if things get moving. Henry Kissinger tells the story of a woman coming up to him at a party and saying, "They say you're a fascinating man. Fascinate me." Well, you're supposed to be an argumentative panel in an argumentative conference, so argue. Let's kick it off by just asking Sadnand to really put some flesh on the bones. What's it actually mean for the US, for India rather, in the context that's been described, to tilt towards the US? If it is the case that China's engaged in not so subtle wooing of the Indian Ocean neighbours, what should India actually be doing about that? And a little further afield in the South China Sea, if China is really exercising its muscle in an unacceptable way, what does it mean for India to take a more aligned position against this in practice? And what do the others then say about whatever you've got to say about that?
Well, I would say that it would mean a couple of things. One thing, of course, is to strengthen the US-India economic relationship. The US remains India's number one trading partner if you include both goods and services. If you look at only goods, only then China is the bigger trading partner. So I think making that economic relationship stronger and more important to the US, India I think is only number 12 for the US, is very important for India's own interest. India should rise in the ranking of US trade partners. That's one large part of it. I don't really have a problem with India being involved in BRICS or having good relations with everybody or being involved in 20 different alphabet soup organizations. That all makes sense, and it makes sense to sort of pursue them. But I think that there should be a clear sense of prioritization. And that means that, for example, when there are conflicts that are not central to Indian interests, but are very important to US interests, I don't think India should go about picking disputes over there. I think that the key for India is to focus on its own region, cooperate with the US in places like Sri Lanka. In fact, if you look around the neighborhood, wherever you've seen Chinese power rise, it's very clear that it has been deleterious to Indian interests. And I think Sri Lanka is probably the best example there, where the very close relationship of the Chinese with the Rajapaksa regime has in fact made it harder for India to influence Sri Lanka. So I think in the sense of closer trade, more direct statements, you can't have a military alliance, but stepped up trilaterals and quadrilaterals, the sort we now have with Japan, the US, and India. Japan, the US, India, and Australia would be a good example. Getting close to America's friends, Japan and Australia being the best examples. These would, I would say, all be concrete things that India could do.
And if that quadrilateral kind of exercise is seen, as it has been in the past by China, as a containment exercise, how do you react to that?
I think that you should tell the Chinese that it's not necessarily containment, but I think beyond a point, I don't think India's actions should be dictated by Chinese sensitivities necessarily. I don't think you should be overly sensitive to how the Chinese are going to interpret things, because once you start walking down that path, that really allows the Chinese to manipulate what India's positions would be.
Other members of the panel responding to that?
Well, in my case, on Sadnand's point, I think India in its own interest should liberalize sufficiently that its trade grows with many powers. But I think one of the very happy developments in recent years has been the sharp improvement in relationships between India and the United States. We tend to take that for granted today, but if we cast ourselves back, say, 20 years, that would not have seemed particularly likely. But the idea that India should design a foreign policy around the United States, I don't think makes any sense in India.
No, that's not my point. My point is that currently it is in India's own interest, given the reality of Asia, to draw closer to the US.
No, but you were also making the point that you thought India should cozy up to friends of Washington. You have to be careful about how you portray things. The US is not the sole pole in the world today. India has a multiplicity of interests. Probably the relationship with Washington is the single most important interest of India in terms of bilateral relationships. But the idea that India should organize its foreign policy around a single bilateral relationship, I think, is illusory, let's say.
I'm not saying that is not what I'm suggesting. I agree with what you just said.
Yeah. Siddharth, do you want to come
No,
in?
no, I think it's absurd.
While you're doing that, I'll shift this out of the way.
I think it's absurd to put the US at the center of Indian foreign policy decision making, particularly at a time when the global situation is so fluid, particularly at a time when so many American decisions in the wider region. And I don't agree, I don't think, which are these conflicts in which we don't have, like, is Syria not an issue on which India has a point of view? Is India not going to be affected if you have a war triggered against Iran? We have 5.5 million Indians in the Gulf region. And the fact is that in practical terms, because Gareth asked, what does it actually mean in concrete terms? It means in the Security Council, if you're there, or various other initiatives, backing an approach that you know to be wrong. What the US did in Iraq was fundamentally wrong. It cost us. And there was enormous pressure in 2003 for us to send troops to help the Americans get out of the soup that they had landed themselves in. And I would argue that Asian security and Indian interests are served better by actually pushing for the kind of solutions that outstanding global problems desperately need and which the United States and their friends are unable to or unwilling to provide. Iran, let's look at Iran, for example. When Brazil and Turkey pushed for the TRR, the medical reactor deal involving some of the Iranian uranium being housed in escrow in Turkey, perfectly viable option that would have bought the international community a lot of time, shot down peremptorily by the United States. India, and I know this, Indian officials who were around at the time said there's a lot of merit in what the Brazilians and the Turks are proposing, that this offer should be allowed to work. But we didn't step up to the plate. Like, had we lent our heft and said, okay, we're going to back this proposal, this gives us a situation, an opening to restart the diplomatic process, maybe that proposal would have flown. So rather than buying into an American approach, which is counterproductive, which is actually making many of these conflicts worse, I think it's important for us to chart our own course. Of course, working with the US where required. I'm not saying that economic relations should be strengthened with not just the US, every country.
Well, we're starting to get some hands up in the audience now, so start with Amitabh Mattu, but if we've got another mic down that passage, it would help to ease the flow of things. Amitabh?
Thank you, Gareth. I'm a little surprised at some of the arguments.
Keep your mic close.
Sadanand is clear. He believes that it's in our long-term interest to tilt towards the United States. But of the three who believe in some form of strategic autonomy, only David actually thinks there is an inherent value. It's a part of your long-term national interest. Both Michael and Siddharth actually say it's uncertain, it's unpredictable, hedge your bets. The question really is, if there's going to be a Cold War in Asia, if there's a real Cold War between the United States and China, what should India do then? Fair enough, it's turbulent, unpredictable, keep hedging, but when you have to make a choice, what should you do?
Well, what's your answer to that, Amitabh?
If I can give my 2 cents, with your permission.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, my emphasis on Asian architecture is precisely in order to forestall the possibility of this kind of outcome that you're talking about. Because if you allow things to go the way they are, you are looking at a situation of a new Cold War in Asia where there will be enormous pressure on countries like India and Australia to choose one side or the other. And that's harmful. So my view is that India needs to be more active, Australia, other countries, rising Asian powers, to stave off that kind of outcome because it's not inevitable.
Anyone else on the panel?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think the prospect of a Cold War in Asia between the US and China is even remotely possible. The reason is because the interdependence is too tight. The prospect of two blocks of countries confronting each other, I think, is a long way from reality. And I think for that reason, countries like India and Australia will be best served by building very strong relations with both China and the United States, and with each other and with other countries in the region. I think that all of us are best served by a much more fluid multipolar region than one that is between the United States and China.
Okay, question over there, and please introduce yourselves, and then gentlemen up the back after that. Yep. Yes, you.
Yeah, hi, Rajiv Kumar. As one of the co-authors of Nonalignment 2.2, I of course agree with whatever Siddharth has said. But just to make it more interesting, may I support what Sadanand is saying with one example? That it's of course right for us to not agree with the US wherever it's wrong or it's weak and so on and so forth. But why poke it in the eye when we don't need to? And the example that I would like to give is the question of cybersecurity, and the issue that is coming up, and India sort of come up as a votary, in fact, an active votary of the working group being set up to report to the General Assembly of countries that will take the governance of internet governance as opposed to ICANN, where we can be represented. And I asked this of the highest levels in India as to why are we doing it at this point of time. I did not get a clear answer as to which of our national interests are served. So there is a little bit, I think, of a nuance here, where you can not be seen as in the opposing camp in the UN General Assembly or in other issues of global governance, rather than be supportive, rather than be saying, and still be able to maintain your strategic autonomy, which is of course most precious.
Do you want to cast that as a question or treat it as a comment? Comment? Anyone want to respond to that?
Yeah, I'd like to respond.
Senator.
Well, obviously, I agree with you agreeing with me. But no, I think there's something to be said for this, for the poke in the eye idea. And I think the biggest sort of example was the recent non-aligned movement summit in Iran. Now, again, nobody says that India does not have genuine reasons to have good relations with Iran, route to Afghanistan, energy, and so on. But there is an element where India is willing to poke the US in the eye in ways that actually hurt India. What happens in the end is that for many of India's own interests, whether it's UN Security Council expansion, whether it's the kind of attitudes that the US is going to take towards West Asia, the Middle East, towards radical Islamic groups, where India has very real stakes, India is better off being able to influence US policy. India diminishes its own influence, which acts against its own interests, by doing some things which, frankly, are kinds of sort of grandstanding. So that's the sort of, I'd like to sort of,
Gentleman up the back, in the centre, with the mic, I think. Yeah.
Thank you. My name's Peter Hornhart, independent educator. Looking back over the last 100 years, we've had dramatic global shifts in power. Looking forward, do you think long-term that the US has any interest in making sure China and India don't become closer together?
Interesting question. Sadhana?
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be I mean, I don't think the US would like to see a sharp deterioration of India-China relations to the point where there's danger of a disruption. But if I come back to the triangle that I spoke of, I think the US would always like to be in a position where its relationship with China is stronger than China's relationship with India. And I think that's not a good position for us to want to be in. So for us, the issue is to place ourselves in the center. And that's not my argument. Sadanand mentioned Singapore. Kishore Mehbubani, this is his point of view. This is something he argued pretty forcefully a couple of years ago, which has a lot of merit, that India should put itself in the center. And just to come back to the poking in the eye thing, I think, Rajiv, these are complex issues, right? I mean, India has a certain long-term strategic interest in being part of the rule-making process. And ICANN, of course, is much better today than it was 10 years ago. But it still remains an agency which runs internet governance, which at the end of the day, push comes to shove, will be controlled by the United States government. So for us to have a global system, I think the Indian position, the UN CIRP, is very different from what the Russians or the Chinese or others are saying. And it's the Americans who have conflated all of these different approaches. But that's really a topic for another day, I guess.
David?
Just on Sadhanand's point, I think one unhealthy dynamic in international relations is when countries of various sorts have the impression that they're being put on probation by Washington. For example, India, which is an aspirant to a permanent seat in the Security Council, being judged as unworthy, more or less publicly, of a permanent seat because it adopts this position or that. There's a danger for the United States in that. And what's the danger for the United States? That the real action on decision-making on major global issues will migrate away from the Security Council, where the U.S. has a blocking vote. The United States will always be involved in the major decisions, but perhaps without a blocking vote. So Washington may need to readjust its own approach to how it relates to rising powers, because being judged day in, day out publicly by Washington doesn't work politically in emerging powers.
His Excellency the Governor.
No,
It's on.
No, there is a point which I think which having spent several years on both the domestic and the side is...
Perhaps you wouldn't mind standing up, so...
Yeah. Sorry, can you hear me
Would you
now?
mind standing up so people
Okay,
can...
sorry,
Appreciate it, but... Yeah.
No, the point I was making was, countries like India, foreign policy isn't dictated entirely by foreign policy issues. I think there's a strong domestic current. Now, our attitude towards West Asia, for instance, is dictated to a very large extent by the fact that we have tremendous stakes in West Asia, not so much about West Asian politics as much as we have 6 million people in the Gulf. So likewise in many other parts of and then there are issues of how much can you dictate your foreign policy if you don't have deep pockets to it, because you have huge populations which are below the poverty line. So you can't really, what should I say, have a discussion on foreign policy which doesn't take into consideration the requirements of policymakers for how do they deal with their own domestic populations, because their aspirations are there. Actually, with due apologies to the architects of Nonalignment 2.0, I mean, we were three two former national security advisors and one current who discussed this on that way. And I think I raised the issue there that I thought that one of the issues that didn't come out clearly in that document was how much foreign policy has to be to some extent attuned to or tweaked to understand what are the domestic compulsions in this. So I think that is an important point, and it is from that point of view, I think the point that I think both India and as I said, since I have participated in a lot of discussions at the summit level, I think the leaders in both countries, at least the present leadership, I understand that there are limits to their strength. I mean, we see China as unduly assertive, but I think when it comes to some of the major policy issues, they also recognize that they have to avoid a conflict. Certainly it happens in India's case. We have to hedge our bets irrespective of whether our growth rate now is 9% or 10%. We can't afford to have a hiccup in the process. So I thought that is something that we need to also keep in mind when we discuss at least the Asian paradigm.
Anyone like to comment on that?
No,
I think that's
it's right.
Self-evident. Well, I hope to God that domestic policy doesn't govern foreign policy totally in the United States context in particular, but that's another story for another day. Over there, yes. In the front, yeah.
Yeah, my name is Shankar Iyer. I have one intervention in the sense Michael Wesley couldn't relate to us the incident that he wanted to relate, so I thought this would be a good chance for him to relate that incident. And the second part is that's a question which either David Malone or Siddharth, I wanted to, when we talk about multipolar relationships, you're really talking about multipolar transactions. So does the Indian Foreign Service or even the other countries, the Foreign Service, have the kind of capacity to negotiate, understand? We talked about deep pockets, but I also wanted to know whether there is a deep intellect there.
Oh, thanks.
Michael.
Look, the example I wanted to use was earlier this year. We've seen two serious consular incidents between the United States and China. First Wang Lijun and then Chen Guangchen, both of whom went to US diplomatic posts to seek asylum. They were resolved remarkably quickly. So they show that the bilateral relationship between the US and China is actually very good, it's very mature, and it's quite stable. But that means that the rivalry is undertaken through other countries and via other countries, and I think that's where the smaller countries come in, and that's where the jealous relations come in. So that was the example I was going to use for these two-tier relationships.
Okay, 5 more minutes, 3 or 4 more questions if we're quick. Raj Kumar.
Yeah, I'm Raj Kumar, Vice Chancellor of Jindal Global University. David, this question is, in many ways, when Amartya Sen received the Nobel Prize, one of the things which was mentioned was that he brought in ethical dimension to vital economic decision-making process. So if you were to bring in ethical dimension to foreign policy making process, particularly in the context of your new assignment, what do you think ought to be the framework in this sort of framework of India's foreign policy enabling, and to what extent ethics would even matter in the real politic, which will be the framework how nations begin to interact? And Siddharth, a quick question. If you were to look at the capacity building that ought to take place within the Indian Foreign Service, because one of the biggest issues that we are facing, and Shashi Tharoor in his books Pax Indica has argued, is the fact that Indian Foreign Service is continuing to have a capacity issue. I mean, I understand there are 600 IFS officers, even a country like New Zealand has probably more. So the question is, to what extent the Indian Foreign Service itself can deal with these larger issues, and how much of external inputs are necessary and are willing to be heard by the policymakers to shape this policy?
Before you answer, I'll take 3 more questions, and then we'll deal with them collectively, giving the panel a last opportunity to comment in the process. Next question, the lady in the middle there. Yeah. Then gentleman halfway up that side, and then a couple more over there, but no, that's it. Yep.
I'm Hema Sharda from University of Western Australia. I'm quite novice in the area of foreign policy, but I have heard the word vulnerable a lot in the discussions by the panelists, whether it was America feeling vulnerable, whether it was China feeling vulnerable, or India feeling vulnerable, and it made me feel good about myself, because I don't think we common people feel that vulnerable about people taking small steps on our boundaries. My question is India better off dealing with partners with foreign policy development, which help with its 2 important situations? One is poverty and the other is education. Maybe we should look at partners who help build that capacity as our foreign preferred partners, rather than those who are big powers.
Thank you, gentleman there, then Professor Sharma, then gentleman over there, and that'll be it, I think.
Shane Sharan from University of South Australia. The question is, a tiny event in Burma virtually spread to Assam, Hyderabad, and Mumbai and Bangalore, and brought almost entire India to stand still. Are we neglecting Burma, which is largest trading partner with China, as well as in future will maybe transit point for major resource? Are we totally neglecting stability in ranking state, and why we are ignoring that? The question goes to David, who said internal stability of India is what should drive its foreign policy, or any country especially.
Okay, thank you. Professor Sharma?
Very quickly, both Michael and Siddharth are saying that why take sides until we have to. And I think what David is trying to say is independent-minded Australia and independent-minded India are probably beneficial to the United States in the long term. So my question to Sadanand is this tilt towards the US, how much of it is a desire by Americans of Indian origin and the Indians who have returned back studying from the US to reduce that existential angst and the cognitive dissonance of having to deal with two countries that you like?
It's really a great question to wrap up with, but I promised the gentleman over there, so I'm sorry, just one last question.
Yep, I have a question
Name, please.
My name is Sunny, and I have a question to Mr. Michael Wesley, because as he quoted before, Australia's prosperity interest with China and security interest with the US. I agree with that point. But I have a question that it arises a question in my mind as an audience. What's the Australian future foreign policy with India, and how they're going to change and adaptable hand in hand with US and China as per Australian prospects? Thank you.
You'll have to do that in 30 seconds, Michael. But let me go across the panel now and ask you to respond as best you can to the specific questions and make any concluding remarks that you'd like to.
I'll go very fast. And the first point I want to make is I find it quite striking that people are speaking about Australian and Indian strategic autonomy in the same breath. Let me just say that I think that it would be a tremendously great for the US-India relationship if it was anywhere near as strong as the US-Australia relationship. So when we talk about both countries having strategic autonomy, I think there's a very, very different what these mean internally to both countries. And so if Australia can also call it a strategic autonomy, well, I'm all for it. Maybe NATO also has strategic autonomy then. So that's my first point. I mean, on the cognitive dissonance point, I mean that's sort of the realm of pop psychology. I would argue, though, that there is a sort of something serious underlying that, which is that the fact is that there are large diaspora populations in the US, in Australia, in Canada, and these countries that have very close ties with India. I think that's a huge benefit to India. It's a benefit to India, and it also gives India greater stakes and a greater ability. One of the things that sort of made this nuclear deal happen was really the fact that the Indian-American community was very firmly behind it. I think the fact that these links exist means that all things are not equal. It is in India's interest for the US to be the more dominant power simply because India has a greater ability to influence and have a voice in US policy, partly because of the diaspora. So that's my sort of response to that. And I would hope that there's a similar feeling among Australian Indians that they would like the two countries to be drawn closer rather than far apart.
David.
Great, thank you. I think I'll limit myself to 2 points. On an ethical dimension to Indian foreign policy, there's been quite a debate in India, and I've participated in it on the margins, on India's soft power and how that might best translate into Indian diplomacy. Shashi Tharoor has been a champion of the concept. But I think actually conceptions of soft power vary enormously. In current Indian foreign policy, there is an attempt to market Indian soft power, but it's more the power of attraction of Indian diversity, landscapes, art, and so on. The idea that India might want to more actively influence other countries on issues like democracy, the struggle for justice, both of which are so present in India and so intense in India, is something that the foreign policy establishment is very uncomfortable with in India. It's not just the Ministry of External Affairs that has at best an ambivalent view of that more widely. On the other hand, I think the Indian view that non-interference should be a very important principle in international relations is fine. You have your principles, I have 900 contradictory principles. It doesn't get you very far. On Burma, in a way, India missed the train. Why? it became so comfortable with the idea that nothing was going to change in Burma that it didn't actually keep reminding the Burmese of what the Indian experience had to tell them positively about their own future. And this might have been done, in fact, without alienating the military authorities in Burma. So I think Burma is a minor key wake-up call to those practicing foreign policy in India, and it's not just the MEA, that thinking a bit more about soft power could be to India's benefit. And on whether India has the capacity diplomatically to do everything it needs to do, the Indian diplomatic service is pound for pound one of the very best in the world. Its analysis is unsentimental, and you find this out when its members retire and start writing about their own views on what Indian foreign policy should have been or should be. But it's very small, and the Indian government has been struggling unsuccessfully with trying to enlarge the Indian foreign service apparatus, so to speak, to the point where it can compete effectively with the very large establishments elsewhere.
Yeah, I think for a country of India's global ambitions, the size of the foreign policy, the net foreign policy making capabilities are really abysmal. The size of the Indian Foreign Service is one aspect. But if you look at the number of competent trade negotiators, if you look at the number of competent experts in the field of climate change, environment, internet governance, can India field 20 lawyers for an international conference who know the ins and outs of internet law, or any other forum where global rules of the road are being formulated? And we have managed under very difficult circumstances. I mean, conferences where we barely managed to send 1 or 2 people, and they hold their own because, as David said, they're really exceptional individuals. But you can just imagine the amount that could be accomplished if the MEA and all other ministries had the kind of capabilities, and which, if they were supported by, Amitabh, by academia. Because the fact is that even, I had this conversation with somebody in the national security, the NSCS, that why don't you have more lateral people from academia, and this person said, where are they in academia? Like if the NSCS wants to hire Baloch-speaking academics, they don't exist. And Pakistan is such a vital neighbor of India. I dare say even Urdu-speaking or Bengali-speaking and Sinhala-speaking, we lack those capabilities. So I think across the board, the kind of investment needed in the tools of foreign policy making, whether it's by the corporate sector or by the media. I mean, I'm fortunate enough to work for a paper which takes global news and has traditionally taken it very seriously. So, we have 12 foreign correspondents around the world, but that's very rare. Most Indian papers manage with just one person in Sadanand's favorite country. I think that affects. And just I can't. On the ethics issue, I just want to say that one of the, just to come back to Nonalignment 2.0. We were very clear that India, if a rising India, an India that emerges on the global stage, is to simply be yet another global power in the way that global powers have always been. If we buy into the same cynical power game, then that's really no good. Nothing is achieved. We can feel happy as Indians that we're doing this nonsense. But the fact really is to be a factor for positive change. And I think that's also part of the attraction of India globally. When countries in Africa, Latin America, Asia want to back India at the Security Council, they're doing so because they know that India is not going to simply vote like Croatia or Japan or Australia. When issues come up, they hope that India will actually take a stand and do the right thing. So this expectation, I think, is also important that we need to feed into our own foreign policy making process. I think ethics is absolutely important.
Michael.
Just on security and prosperity, any country's two basic interests, security and prosperity, for those to be pulling in different directions is a nightmare scenario. We're not the only country in the region that is a prospect for. There are many others. And I think we too often don't acknowledge that we have a lot more in common with the countries that are immediately next to us than we think. I think that the solution is to make sure that it's not such a clear division, that our interests with China are more than just prosperity interests, that we build out that relationship to become a full and rich relationship, including a security relationship, and that our relationship with the United States doesn't lapse into becoming just a security relationship, that it becomes a rich and full relationship, and that we build similar sorts of relationships with India, with Indonesia, with the countries of Southeast Asia and so on.
I'm not going to try to sum up, A, because it's too hard, and B, because we're too hungry. But let me just say that we've been very well fed indeed already intellectually, and I'd ask you to join with me in thanking the panel for an excellent session.